call, and also to see so many of the folks who've responded to Metrics Madness in the spirit of the season. Although somebody reminded me that you could also think of it as, instead of the finale of Metrics Madness, the preview to opening day of baseball. So you can pick your sport. As always, go ahead and start introducing yourselves in the chat, and maybe for today, say obviously who you are and where you're coming from, but what you're measuring, and maybe briefly, very briefly, why. The Metrics Madness is a brainchild of Dorian, Burton, and Napoleon Wallace at the Southern Reconstruction Fund, who you'll meet in a minute. But I want to just welcome everybody else to the call. Cynthia Muller, an old friend from the Kellogg Foundation. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Great. Erika, Seth, Davies, I believe coming to us from Portugal. Erika, welcome.
That is indeed correct. Hi, thank you for having me.
And Wilson Lester from Partners in Equity. Hi, Wilson. Are you? Oh, you're muted. Isaac, help out with the unmuting, please.
There you go. Hi, Wilson Lester. Happy to be on the call.
Great to have you. And Mike McCreless from Impact Frontiers. Hi, Mike.
Hi, David. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Vijay Haddadi from Syntegral, who's been a great help and is our going to come in with a little bit of a AI perspective in a minute. And also Chelsea McDaniel, who's been super helpful in pulling this all together. But let's bring in Dorian and Napoleon. Hi, Dorian.
How you doing today, David? Super excited to be here. Dorian Burton, managing partner of the Southern Reconstruction Fund in Fund 1.
And Napoleon, I don't see on my screen. Napoleon, are you here? Okay. Napoleon will join in a sec. Okay, so yeah. Dorian, you want to just we're gonna show a film in a second, and that just gives you a little bit of sense of the Southern Reconstruction Fund. I just wanted to bring Dorian to bring Napoleon in if
Absolutely. If he's not in just a minute, then we'll probably
let's run the film and then we'll bring him in.
Sounds good.
Isaac, can you cue that up for a sec?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. The poetic pump fake of happiness didn't come until later. Penned nearly 250 years ago, this language birthed the American experiment and is clear as evidence of America's economic independence. Published the same year, Smith's Wealth of Nations provided a blueprint for how emerging economies might organize and how enterprise and whiteness could accrue vast wealth in the New World. With the gift of hindsight, today our gaze has shifted from those who were not in the room and those who were not considered people at the time. Built without the wealth and health of all communities in mind, people of color have had to remix and reimagine economic realities outside of and on top of the station that was originally forced on us. Introducing the Fund for Ownership and New Equity. Fund 1 imagines, innovates, invests at the intersection of ownership, entrepreneurship, and justice. We invest to catalyze communities of color to fulfill their highest purpose and achieve their wildest ambitions together. We understand that racial justice is an essential element if we are to fulfill America's promise of economic liberty. Fund 1's Impact First theory of change relies on capital investment that prioritizes the health and wealth of communities in which we invest, making investments in a future that builds long-term, multi-generational impact, healing, equity, and justice. We are building a culture of capital that no longer extracts physical, financial, and intellectual assets from communities of color, but instead encourages those assets to accrue to their natural owners. Tomorrow's solutions are in the imaginations of today's most underestimated leaders and entrepreneurs. And the new wealth of our nation is dependent on the health and wellness of its Black communities. Our approach to capital allocation is not complex, but doing the right thing rarely is.
We are Fund One. We are Fund One.
We are Fund One.
Fund One. Fund all.
Great, thank you, Dorian. And now I see Napoleon. Hi, Napoleon.
Hey, David, we'll get started and going on. We'll have Napoleon hop in just a minute.
Yeah.
We can go ahead and we'll mute all, and then go ahead and we'll hop in, and I'll talk a little bit about the work of the Southern Reconstruction Fund, how Fund One came to be, as we get into this space, and then we'll have Napoleon hop in and around kind of the idea around kind of metric madness, what in all his brilliance that came to be, and open up the conversation in a little bit of a broader way.
Beautiful. I wanted to just ask you, Dorian, before we get into the specifics, just the name both of and the tie back to Reconstruction, and that's been, as you know, something that ImpactAlpha has keyed in on the last couple of years. We had a whole podcast series and a whole section around that, and the promise of Reconstruction and the Southern Reconstruction Fund has an ImpactAlpha thesis we've noticed. So that obviously resonates as well. But just tell us a little bit about just why the historical tie back.
Yeah, so for us, it really started off of what the unfulfilled promise of Reconstruction could and should be. As we were thinking about this work, we were really brought into with some early funding from two really courageous family members from the South that actually had ties or ancestral ties to the Wilmington Massacre. And for them, it was an opportunity to think about what and how do we sit on the right side of history? How do we move from spaces where our capital has been extractive to places that it can be restorative? And for us to really think about Wilmington as that starting point, and the thought of we had a thriving Black community, and the violence that was perpetrated against that space and against that community, to really kind of think about the end of what could have been. And so for us, standing up the Southern Reconstruction Fund, Napoleon and I started to write it not knowing that we were going to come over and lead it. And we said, early on that there were three things that really needed to be addressed. The first was, from a regional standpoint, if you were talking about equity, that really had to run through the South. I think that there was a lot of conversations around, specifically in Black communities, but there were a lot of conversations, and if you ground that into, back to the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of conversations that were happening about what does it look like to be able to create equitable spaces. And so for us, particularly if we're talking about Black communities, we said that had to run through the South. 55% of Black communities are based in the South. If you actually touch 6 Southern cities, you'll touch 50% of undercapitalized Black communities, right? So Memphis, Birmingham, New Orleans, Charlotte, Houston, and Atlanta. I think one of the things that's also not talked about is if you look at 90% of the families that identify as rural Black families are actually located in the South. And so you have the largest concentration of Black communities that are in the South and the largest concentration of undercapitalized Black communities that are in the space. So the first one was around the region that we needed to be in. The second was, as we thought about creating an impact platform, we knew that philanthropy is traditionally the way that people try to move social change. And we know that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think when I first came into philanthropy, probably about a decade ago, what I quickly realized is that one, we rewarded people who told the worst stories the best about the communities that we served. And the second piece was we were drastically undercapitalizing or continue to kind of perpetuate some of the inequalities that we were trying to solve for by continuing to undercapitalize our communities. And so we needed to think about how do we bring all the financial tools to bear, knowing that communities need different types of capital at different times. And so for us, it was the mix of being able to bring the power of philanthropy into the space, but also being able to bring the power of impact investing into that in a different way. And that was chiefly important. For example, I would make a investment in a school, for example. 2 or 3 days later, I had speculators start to buy the houses across the street from the school. So it was really clear that we needed to think about different types of capital for folks to allow folks to be able to thrive in place and to really make long-term change. So the second was around the types of capital. The third was really about scale, right? And you and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. As we think about real change in our communities, that doesn't happen in $100,000 short-term grant cycles, right? We need to start that conversation at least in the billions. And so for us to continue to undercapitalize communities, we need to move into a very different arena when we're having these conversations. And you and I had that conversation yesterday saying, as we're raising capital right now, I have never heard $1 billion be bold unless folks are talking about Black communities, right? And so for us, that conversation scale needs to be able to meet scale. And so those were kind of our 3 criteria to come over and lead this work. And so one of our early initiatives is Fund One, which is the video that you just saw. And it exists to drastically diversify and accelerate while growing the universe of market-changing ImpactAlpha thesis being commercialized as novel fund strategies. And for us, it wasn't enough just to be, to bring in and fund diverse managers. It really was an idea around how do you start to bring in and diversify ideas in this space, knowing that there's hidden alpha into our communities, knowing that the folks that are most proximate to the spaces are going to make a different set of decisions in those investments. And we can't do impact into our undercapitalized spaces through this kind of random walk, right? We need to be very strategic in our efforts to be able to do that. And so that was, our early kind of fund strategy and our first initiative to really be able to think about funding these novel capital thesis in those spaces that can create those impact alpha returns.
Terrific. Let's pause there and bring in Napoleon, who I met down in Durham a couple months ago. And we've been kind of jamming ever since. And he brought to me, I don't know whether it was his idea or yours, Dorian, but Napoleon, you had this idea that there was a universal metric to be had that somehow similar to, say, carbon in the climate context, that everybody can kind of get organized around and measure and then make progress on. What are you hoping to find in from metrics madness here?
I am so hyped to be here and to be in conversation with the OGs of the impact, racial equity and impact metrics sectors. I'm a Carolina alum, so my bracket was busted back in February. I love my Tar Heels, but I think I speak for all UNC fans when I say that every distraction since mid-February has been a welcome distraction. That said, thank you, David and the ImpactAlpha team, for hosting Metrics Madness. It doesn't fully remove the sting of going from preseason #1 to attorney snub, but I'm not actively crying into a beer, which is genuine progress.
Beautiful. Just to
I
name it
during one of our earlier discussions, and I know this is probably the wrong thing to say, but if I can be honest, with all of this politically motivated woke capital ESG backlash, I personally been sensing a dispirited vibe in a lot of the rooms I have been in lately. Fund One will obviously see some direct benefit from crowdsourcing ideas and recommendations for our impact metrics from the sector's best. But along with that, we're trying to push a little lighthearted happy out into the world.
Thank you for that. Just to be clear and to make it clear for folks, Dorian has a diagnosis of ALS and is speaking through a headset that allows him to voice his text, essentially. So that if you were wondering about that. Napoleon, as we were talking, you have your sort of finger on the scale for the competition here around something you've been taken by, quality adjusted life years. Do you want to let us know why that appealed to you?
Given the broadness of our impact goals, we have looked at many potential metrics at the individual, household, business, fund, neighborhood, and community levels. What we found is a universe of impact metrics that could be applied to individual investments and fund investments, and we received many from our partners in the community members where they are hoping to have an impact. What we haven't been able to uncover is a pool of metrics that have universality, or meaning that they remained a meaningful measure of impact across investments, or a metric that could act as a common standard of exchange that would allow us to interpret many metrics with a single measure. The closest thing we heard was a recommendation from a health economist to consider using quality adjusted life years. QALYs, which is a well-established metric of clinical efficacy, uses a patient's duration and quality of life post-intervention to determine the impact of an intervention. The base concept which holds is that there are few impact goals that are as universal as a longer and happier life, and there are few outputs or outcomes that cannot be attributable to the estimated length and duration of life. The highest logical hurdle is to think of the investment of capital as a potentially life-changing intervention. Who knows if we will get there, but we think it is surely worth a shot. Don't know if there is any chance of running an income statement that shows the amount of years a company has added to the war.
Okay. The challenge has been laid down. We promised you some, a bracket. We didn't quite get to a bracket, but we did get to 10 submissions, mostly from you all. And we're going to try to sort of rank order them just to have some kind of audience participation here. Isaac, do you want to explain how this is going to work?
Sure. I thought that was going to be you. So no, that's fine. So what's going to happen is I'm going to open up the poll and you're going to see 10 metric options, which I'm hoping that David will do or someone will explain what they are. And you're going to select 5 of them that you think are the top ones and rank them 1 through 5. So your top choice will be 1, your second 2, and so on and so forth. Only vote for your top 5 when you see it and leave the rest blank. And if this all goes well, then maybe we'll do a sort of a normal kind of voting thing for the top 2. Zoom is not really set up to do ranked choice voting for whatever reason. So you could select 1 for everything, but don't do that. Do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 is your favorite. 5 is still better than the other 6, and then leave 5 of them blank. Does that make sense? Should I launch the poll, or do you want to explain them first, David?
Okay. So because once you launch it, people will vote. So let me, there's no way for people to see it before I explain it, right?
Well, just don't vote until you understand what you're voting for. How about that?
Okay. Hold off on the voting, but show it so that I can run through them. Okay. So you all are seeing this ranked choice, metric madness ranked choice. All right. So yes. So don't vote. Access to financial services is relatively self-explanatory, but it could be measured, for example, on % of folks getting their first access to capital, their first loan. Improved access to services is a catch-all that might have included financial services, but it includes things like access to transportation, access to healthcare, access to retirement accounts. And we have some specific ones which we can dig into. So if you choose that one, we can then possibly go rank order which particular service might be a stand-in for the broader whole. Increase in wealth, I think, was going to be measured by literal client assets, improved as measured by assets for BIPOC clients. That's Caitlin Rosser of Calvert Impact. The mean racial pay gap for full-time employees suggested by Nuvine's Roberta Lobo is kind of similar to the gender pay gap that is mandated, I think, at least in the UK and other places, as per reporting. Quality adjusted life years, you just heard Napoleon describe that one. Diverse asset management trifecta was suggested by Adam Bendel of Tonic, and the reason it's a trifecta is that he said that the way to measure it is A, percentage of assets managed by majority asset managers of color, B, percentage of assets invested in enterprises that are majority owned and led by people of color, and C, percentage of assets invested in enterprises in which at least 50% of the customers live in marginalized communities. So again, that you get a sort of package on that one. The increase in ownership rates and value, again, you know, there could be ownership in multiple things. We'll hear from Wilson in a moment about business property ownership, obviously home ownership, and then I think worker ownership fits in there as well. So sort of ownership strategies in general. The number and quality of jobs suggested by Shruti Goel of Rhia Social Ventures. And the quality of life was really improved quality of life for BIPOC customers, employers, and suppliers. And it's essentially a self-reported number, like through a poll that maybe 60 decibels might do. So self-reporting of the improvements. And then the last one came in late, but it's a model of community well-being, apparently used in New Zealand. And Emmy Van Cleef submitted that. And I'm not quite sure how you measure it, but if you want a sort of holistic, community-based, place-based measure, that would be for you. So now you know what it is. We'll obviously discuss these in more depth, but at least that's a little context. Go ahead and pick your top 5, and as Isaac said, give each one a selection from 1 to 5. I apologize for the noise here. We're having a torrential downpour, so if that's coming through, I apologize, but nothing I can do about it. I don't know if other folks are having it. I selected my 5, Isaac, and I can't submit. Are people having that problem?
People seem to be submitting. At so far, 26 of 170. Yeah, well, we're edging towards a quarter of everyone has submitted, so people are figuring it out. And maybe once we get a bit higher, we can. Oh, do you have to rank all of them to submit? Is that true?
Maybe anything you didn't vote for, rank at 5.
Yeah, maybe that's how we have to do it. So if you're not able to submit, then rank everything 5, and we're gonna end up with a lot of 5s. Now look, they're just coming in super fast now. Almost half have submitted.
Yeah, you have to vote on each one. So we'll see. This is slightly less than scientific. Okay. A few more seconds, and then let's move on. Okay. All right. So while we wait for results, oh, I guess we already see the results. Are you? Can you? We weren't gonna. I'm not gonna. Yeah, you weren't supposed to show that yet, but I'm not gonna analyze the results yet. Cynthia, help bring us back. You're both at Kellogg, you're both an investor, also part of a foundation that's had a long and deep strategy around racial equity. So just give us a little context how you articulate a racial equity strategy, and then what are you measuring?
Yeah, David, it's great to be here, and I love this ranked choice voting. Hi, everybody. Cynthia Muller, Director of Mission-Driven Investment at the Kellogg Foundation out of Battle Creek, Michigan. And so for us, it's come into a framework where we really focus at the kind of the levels. So what I really appreciated about the ranked choice voting, and I saw the results, but I haven't analyzed them yet, but is that we look at kind of how this is playing out in the various systems. So at the end of the day, for the Kellogg Foundation, Mr. Kellogg wanted us to focus on the question, are the children well? So we look at that through working families. We look at that through thriving children in equitable communities. So we want to have a holistic understanding of how that's playing out. Now, how does that work within our investments? Within the racial equity lens, we look at representation, right? We all know that one, that, who's in the room, right? But then we go a level deeper and looking at who owns the asset, right? Who are the asset owners here? Who are the GPs? Who are the entrepreneurs? Then we go into, well, okay, how's this playing out in the community? Are we only putting these in white communities? Are we putting these in to Napoleon and Dorian's previous, are we looking at the South, which I just really appreciate that, because we need to remember that the South is very big and it has a lot of our Black population and it is investable. We also look at, the existing players, right? So this is a little bit of the controversial aspect of who has influence that we can influence, right? So we've invested in big asset managers, they're predominantly white-led, who we are walking alongside with as they are exploring their journey and helping to navigate some of those dynamics. Is that the only way we do it? No, but we do have to recognize there are players in this work. But that also means that we've got to look at, how do we increase the number of entrepreneurs, GPs, and otherwise that truly represent the communities that we're trying to support, and in this case, Black and Brown communities. And then lastly, we really want to understand, what is the innovation, what is the play that's really kind of going to open up the destruction of the racial wealth gap, right? So how do we think about these different ways to rewire the capital markets, how we understand underwriting, how do we manage these portfolios?
Thank you. Again, I apologize. We've thought of everything. We've had every kind of interruption on these calls. We've never had a giant hailstorm, which we now have. So.
Hey, it's big stuff, right? We, I think like Napoleon said, we got a lot of pushback. Got to fight through it.
Cynthia, there's something that comes through, and we looked, in the context of this, we looked through a dozen or so frameworks and toolkits and whatnot for investors, how to think about racial equity investing. There's kind of something that comes through, which is Black economic empowerment, lifting up Black populations, and then a broader point that closing racial wealth gaps is good for everybody. The policy link, which put one out, we wrote up last week, talks about the curb cut effect, that the curb cut that you might have put in for wheelchairs is actually helpful for strollers and delivery people as well. And I think you were the one who first introduced me to the concept of targeted universalism, which I think is the wonky term for it. So how do you just think about those two sort of parts of the discussion?
So when I was introduced to targeted universalism, when I joined Kellogg almost 7 years ago, it was around this discussion around investing in a fund manager, right? And in this case, it was a white-led fund manager. And the question I got was, well, if we go with them, who are we missing, right? And is this manager, in this case, the manager who's going to be able to bring that lens so it creates more opportunities, not only for X, I think this one was like in healthcare, or the X community, but does it think about everybody? And I think that was the big aha for me, is when you go into these transactions, you look at them and you're like, well, all right, so let's say clean tech, right? And we're looking at an innovation. Okay, so great, we can get this for middle income Americans, but how is that going to engage, Black Americans? Are they going to be able to afford this, right? And what's been nice is, as I've been going to different annual meetings and meeting with different managers, you're starting to hear this. They're not calling it targeted universalism. They're really calling it, these are, underrepresented markets, right? And we see the opportunity because there's larger numbers and things like that. But nonetheless, it still gets at these markets in a way where you can engage a larger swath of communities, in this case, Black communities. So if you start to design that way, everything kind of falls into place. And so I think the hardest part is when you're working with managers or plays that are trying to be certainly national in scope and they're trying to do one size fits all, it's hard. It's just hard for them to do that. So they really have to think really systematically about what are they designing for. If they're going to hit Black communities, then they got to hit all of them, right? They got to hit them all in a thoughtful and meaningful way. And that's something that we spend a lot of time with our partners with, and something that I've certainly learned from Napoleon over the years and the work that we've funded through the activist initiative that they've got going. And for us, I think it's really started to play out in really interesting ways because, over 90% of our portfolio is going into Black and Brown communities. And then of that, we have nearly 50% of our managers represent Black and Brown managers, but almost all of them have plays where they're thinking about how do they engage different entrepreneurs? How are they restructuring the power dynamic as an investor? How are they ensuring that the entire supply chain? So not only that they're kind of doing the numbers piece, but they're thinking about the entire vertical of how they do the work is benefiting Black and Brown communities. So recently I was at an annual meeting, and it's an e-commerce or kind of an e-commerce fund. And you go to the annual meetings and you go look at the products and stuff. And I ordered a product and it came from Mississippi. And I was like, wait, how is this coming from Mississippi? And they were like, oh, well, we find really affordable storage out there and packing. And so we've got an entire vertical of jobs that come out of the state. And for us, this is an incredible value add, because then it's not just, a Black or Brown or female entrepreneur, but it's about like the entire way that these companies are working. And so it's just embedding that into your entire framework from on the investor level all the way down to your business level.
Terrific. Stick around if you can, Cynthia. I know you might have to jump, and if you have to, then don't worry. But we're going to move to Wilson Lester at Partners in Equity. I met back at the Mission Investors Exchange Conference in Baltimore a few months back. And Wilson, do you want to just briefly explain the strategy? It's I think falls under the ownership. And your colleague Talib Graves-Mann actually submitted the business ownership metric, but maybe let us know what Partners in Equity is about.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me, and really big shout out to Dorian and Napoleon for coming up with this concept for March Madness on the metrics. So Partners in Equity is a investment fund that strategically targets Black and Brown communities, particularly those that are renting real estate, businesses that have been in existence in our communities for several years or longer and want to transition from being a tenant to a tenant owner. So we are that patient partner that goes into business with those owners to support them in the acquisition of their permanent location. Those business owners that don't have access to the friends and family around, the network that can support them with that down payment that's required to secure commercial capital in their transaction. So we have started that in North Carolina and are scaling our fund to the rest of the Southeast, and it's quite rewarding work.
So ownership, I think folks who may have been on our, final call of last year, when we were picking the word of the year, ownership was, I think, a top contender, and it plays out as you said in business ownership, plays out in home ownership. We've done a lot on worker ownership. Why is ownership so important?
Ownership is a transferable asset. So, is so important for our communities to have access to the ability to own this asset that's creating a remarkable dynamic for them. So you think about the business owner that's a tenant. In most cases, business owners are saving over $1,000 a month in their monthly payment. So that's wealth that's hitting the bottom line. It can be reinvested in the business, or it can be saved for the future. And it's allowing that business owner to, take a look how they can change the wealth dynamic in their family in just one generation. And that can happen from a commercial perspective. And that could also happen from a residential perspective. And, speaking of residential.
Whoops. Okay.
I'll pick up on one other piece that I know Wilson would talk about.
Great, thank you.
As you think about this work, and as you think specifically about investment in communities of color, I think they're often categorized from an individual basis. You always hear that you were successful when you make it out of your community, right? I think that question around ownership is really about being able to thrive in place. You shouldn't have to go outside of your community to be able to own what you need to own, or to be able to be successful. And so when you're talking about deeply rooted ownership into our spaces, you have to be able to think about communities and how we thrive in place in a holistic way.
Yeah, I'm going to interject myself here. I've become a fan of a term that comes out of sort of the labor context called fair gain sharing. And it relates usually to, labor contracts and who gets what share of the profits. And as unions negotiate, they talk about the gain sharing. But I think it has a broader context, which is, as you say, Dorian, you want to be able to ride the uplift, not be displaced by the uplift. And so if ownership can be better distributed, then as a community comes up, there could be community ownership, but there's also individual property ownership, home ownership, as you say, and then as the community comes up, the people in that community get the benefit. I don't quite know what the metric for or how that gets measured, but I'm sure that there are ways now to be able to track that.
I also think that ownership leads to investable income, right? And so you'll hear a lot of conversation around, we need to have livable wages in communities of color. I would make the argument that through ownership, you need to create investable wages, because I think if you have an investable wage, you're actually able to shape markets, to co-create markets, and to develop new markets, which is crucial for us to be able to actually be able to build wealth. And
Terrific.
So, I use that sense. I have 4 little ones. I've never strived for my little ones to grow up and to have a livable wage, right? I've strived for them to grow up and have an investable wage, because that means that we're creating wealth in a little bit of a different way. And so I think that dynamic around ownership is really important to note.
Thank you. Let's bring in Erika, Seth Davies. Hi, Erika. I never know whether to introduce you as Rhia Ventures, which I think is your new gig, or what I originally met you at as the Racial Equity Asset Lab.
I'm both.
You can wear both hats.
I can wear both hats. Yeah, it's applicable. Happy to be here. Thanks again for having me. And I tend to come at this from understanding equity, racism as a system, and so tackling it that way, and have created a framework for understanding both process and outcome for decision making, because it's all of these things. And when sitting in the asset owner seat or the investor seat, at any point along the chain, you should be asking a certain set of questions about how you're doing your work, what the approach you're taking, in addition to what that ultimate outcome you believe should be. So if you skip over some of these steps, you're just doing charity by another means. You're not actually seeking to change much of anything. And so if we don't change the how we do what we do, the end result won't change either. And so creating a way of reflecting on process to be able to do that. So yeah, that's what I.
Do you want to explain your framework that you mentioned? And maybe one of my colleagues can put it in the chat, the link, but it's one of the frameworks that we rounded up the other day. And there's a 4-point scale.
Yeah.
Do you want to just explain the spectrum?
So I developed this, and I didn't create the spectrum. That was created by the Casey Foundation and their Advancing the Mission Toolkit. But what it is and what I created it for was decision making initially for asset owners. So in 2020, when everybody's making promises to do right by Black folks, at least in terms of capital, I had a lot of outreach, and what I realized were a lot of people weren't actually ready to do the work. And so I created it as more or less as a self-assessment, and then realized people didn't even understand why some of the elements were in it that are. But basically using a 4-stage learning continuum. So to help folks understand where they're entering the work. And it simply goes from colorblind to equity focused. So thinking about colorblind as status quo, your decision making either by design or default is not thinking about considering any issues around equity. So if we take it to the basic diversity, equity, and inclusion, like none of that is in there, and no data is being considered, no, statements or an understanding of why that work is important. And I would say, particularly in financial services, over time, that again, we know that this generates racialized results. So it's not a race neutral position. It's simply ignoring what is there. Thinking about next step would be diversity only. And so this is a place not necessarily attuned to equity, and is probably not going to be very active around issues of inclusion either. It's much more about optics and visibility, but not actual change. So moving from that to a race tentative place. This is where data is showing that there are disparities, like the things that we already know, and people are using that to actually inform decision making. But that isn't seen as central to actually achieving mission, or it's not seen as central to advancing whatever it is that is central to that mission, that ensuring that there's an equity lens or an equity analysis on that work and that approach. So at the equity focused place on the continuum, this is where it's very race intentional, and basically organizations and decision makers recognize that all of their decisions and functions need to be race informed in order to advance an overall impact. And so kind of taking that and looking at really 10 features, everything from stated commitment. We had a lot of people saying a lot of things, but not really understanding the things that they were saying and getting called out on it. So really having clarity about everything from stated commitment to accountability, who's responsible for what in the decision-making process, and how often are we checking our work to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do, the stakeholder engagement and fully understanding what that means, right? Like it's not just telling Black folks what you're going to do in their community, but it's actual shifting of power and decision-making, so that is a conscious process through to narrative change. I think, Dorian, you talked about philanthropy being about who told the worst story the best, right? Like that's a commitment to a particular narrative. And we've got to be willing to undo that, understand that there are dominant narratives that serve a particular interest, and we've got to question those and come up with alternative counter narratives, if you will, and move those forward as well, to really being clear that this is a systems change effort. And so some things may just have to fall away for new approaches to rise. And so thinking about, and I think it's about 10 features. So if you put the link in the chat, you'll see where some of those questions are. And so it really is holding everyone accountable for advancing this work.
So it is obviously, complex with multiple factors. Is it possible just to take up Napoleon's challenge to come up with a single metric?
I like the quality of life, but I really don't know if it's possible, but I'm willing to be open and lean into some of the ones that came up.
What do you ask your investees at Rhia to measure?
So we've actually adapted this for reproductive and maternal health equity. And so thinking about additional layers. So we talk about it at the intersections of race, gender, and health. And, also considering access and affordability, right? Because that's a key component of this as well. So I do ask a similar set of questions about where they're entering our portfolio, so that we can understand where our support needs to be directed. Because in the same way you're going to do a financial analysis to understand performance and, exit potential, that there are things that have to be in place for that to happen. Similarly, with moving equity in an organization and with respect to our investments, health equity, there are things that have to be in place for that to happen as well. And so that's what we're asking questions about, whether it's around data, stakeholder engagement, strategy or focus on access and affordability, right? So these are the things that if you're going to get an innovation to where it is most needed, that you've got to take into consideration in terms of organization, product development, go-to-market strategy, et cetera.
Terrific. I'm going to ask Isaac to put up the results again, which you saw briefly there. I believe it's kind of tightly grouped there. Can everybody see that now? I think the winner may be, Wilson, you may be happy about this, increase in ownership rates and value, number 7. But they're all kind of clumped up there, which is there's probably all within the margin of difference. Maybe Mike McCreless, you can help us sort out some of these methodological questions. Mike, are you with us? Yeah, there you are. Why are even metrics? Why are we even worried about metrics? Why is it important to measure in the first place?
Hey, David, it's so great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. And that's maybe the hardest question. I'm honestly mainly here to support Dorian and Napoleon and Erika, Cynthia, the Wilson, whose work I so admire and have learned so much from over the years. I guess the two things I'd point at are to know if something is working and to make decisions. And if I had to choose one, I would choose to make decisions. In this case, to drive capital towards what will do the most, advance equitable outcomes the most. We were talking about how would you know if one metric is better than the other? And you asked me about what are the methodological considerations I'm gonna want to have. Honestly, I would say the cardinal rule is don't impose your values on the community that you're measuring. That's the number one thing. Listen to the community and take your cue from them. Heavens knows if you're a middle-aged white guy like I am, don't come in with your clipboard and your values and I'm gonna tell you what I think. No. Nobody wants that. It's not going to fly. We've got white people doing the investing and white people doing the impact management. So I'm a big fan of the process we're going through here, where it's a group of people who are not white middle-aged men like me who've proposed a bunch of metrics and who are also voting on those metrics. And I would even go further and say if there's a way to get the voices of the communities experiencing these outcomes into the vote, that would even push me in the further direction of we're on it.
Just on that, she's off, I think, on spring break with her children, but Lindsay Smalling at 60 decibels was very helpful in the process of this, and she would, I think, echo ask the folks most affected directly. I think 60 decibels does it literally by surveying them and thousands at a time, and to try to have a more of a bottom up approach to this.
And Mike and David, I think that the other piece in that is that you're not just measuring outputs, and you're actually looking at impact-based outcomes, right? You can use the example from philanthropy. One of the questions that we would ask when we would invest in spaces around homelessness, for example, we might invest into a housing shelter and says, are we pushing for more beds, right? Which can be into the output, or are we actually pushing towards things that are going to solve and get people in houses and things that they own, right? And address that in a different way. And so I think it's really important for us to think about, are we investing in outputs versus are we investing in actual outcomes? Particularly if we're having the conversation around impact investing and moving into that space around ESG, where you're having a deep conversation around how are we measuring the S? Is it through just a set of volunteer programs or a CSR program, or is it actually through making deep changes into ownership structures, moving away from deep investments in negative or economies that are based on negative externalities, and really moving to places that are built in terms of long-term outcomes for communities of color. And so I think it's important for us to think about those outcomes in a little bit of a different way.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you couldn't agree more, and you even see that in some of the metrics that we voted on. There's one which was, how much are people getting paid, basically, which is something that's sort of under the control of the company. And there's one is how much wealth or assets or communities building, and if how much you're getting paid that's sort of like an output. But there's lots of scenarios where you might increase wages, but it doesn't in the end lead to wealth building. So transitioning to an outcomes focus, you look at, well, what are people actually experiencing in the community? Maybe the thing that I thought would work isn't working. I better double back and figure out what is going on and how we can actually get to that final change in outcomes.
We made, speaking of words of the week, we made our word of the week last week algorithms, because it seemed like suddenly, and you may have noticed, everybody was talking about AI, and it struck me as I was trying to sort out through the metrics that you all nominated and all the different frameworks that this was a perfect use case for AI, because it was sort of too much for any one brain to comprehend. So I turned to my new friend Vijay Haddadi at Syntegral, who crunched through a number of frameworks and came up with, unfortunately, dozens of metrics. Hi, Vijay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect.
So it strikes me, I mean, am I right to think that, once we sort of sort it out through a process like this and a community-driven process, what was the most important, that we could enlist the machines to help us crunch all the numbers and make sense of it?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. Thanks, David, for extending the invitation. It's great to be part of this group of people who are working on what is one of the most important things anyone can do. So it's an honor to be part of this group. If I can say a little bit just as a preparation to that, when I first came into the impact investing space myself, I realized that it was driven by a realization that there's vast amounts of capital out there which could be in the space, but which are not currently in the space. There's a desire from asset owners, from various institutional investors and so on, to be in the space, but they're not, because the assessments and the metrics and the reporting is not there to back up those decisions. So we're looking at a $1 trillion assets under management that could easily be 10 times as much based on several assessments that exist, if the right metrics were there, if the right frameworks for reporting was there. So it's really important work that we're doing here, I think, everybody. And your question, if we can outsource that work to the machine, I think we shouldn't. We could. There's attempts to do that, but I think we should not do that. And I think what we should do is a much more prudent and much more meaningful use of AI, is what we have done in our platform that we've built, in the conversational AI platform that we've built, is to enable all of you with your different strategies, with your different approaches, to empower and augment your approaches to basically give you the added scope of insight to be able to very quickly find the evidence, very quickly find the fitting metrics, very quickly look through large amounts of data around companies or opportunities, which otherwise would take you too long to do. So this is what we have done. This is the approach we have taken, not to, create some type of AI generated score that takes away this difficult work from us. I don't think it's possible, because we heard all of these different strategies right now for how we can actually tackle this issue, and they're all valid. There's nobody from us or no AI that could come and say, no, you're wrong, or no, you're right. It's just about empowering these explorations and these experiments by giving you the added intelligence and the access to all the data that otherwise the human brain cannot contain. So that's what we're doing at Syntegral. And yeah, very happy to explore use cases, to explore different ways to put conversational AI to use to improve impact assessment. If anybody here is interested in this, please feel free to reach out.
Terrific, thank you. I think we're going to have one more poll of the top three, and then we'll give up on that gimmick. But Isaac, do you want to are you ready to queue up the final vote? Here we go. And here you can only choose one. And the winner is, there you go. Well, all those things obviously are interrelated, and as we've I think come to maybe I'm sorry, Napoleon, I'm not sure there is one universal thing, but increase in wealth was the clear winner in this case, and then there'll be a lot of methodological questions of how to measure that and track that, and what the drivetrain between investment and that outcome is, as Dorian was saying. It's now coming on the top of the hour. Obviously, if you have to jump, do, but just to enable some conversation, we'll keep going for another 15 minutes or so. And so I want to now open it up. Particularly, let's give first shout out to folks who actually submitted metrics. I saw Ben Bingham on earlier. Ben had the submission around emergency room usage. I'm sure I haven't seen others here, but if you did take the trouble to submit one, your reward is you get a moment here. So Ben, I see you right there. So you want to just say why you selected that?
Sure. Thanks for giving me the chance to speak. Well, it's just one metric that, in the wealth, if we put wealth as the primary thing and not health, it will tend to be the people that are healthy already. But there are a lot of people that are spending a lot of time in emergency rooms that are uninsured and underinsured. And so we are, I'm chairman of Infinite Workflow, and we are connecting social services to individuals so they can plan their own success, through connection with all of the social services around Greensboro in Guilford County, North Carolina. And we hope to do this around the country and measure. One of the measurements would be to see how much less use the emergency gets from people that are uninsured or underinsured.
So it's kind of a canary in the coal mine kind of thing. If that indicator moves, then probably some other indicators are also moving.
Absolutely,
kind of
yeah. I mean, it's not the end. It's just
right.
Yeah.
Other folks who submitted want to make the case belatedly after the vote. Napoleon, you had Qualies, which came in second. Came in second here. All right, well, let's open the floor.
Yeah, I think there's one other thing around that, Dave, is like when you look at it, when you think about quality of life, I think you're talking about years lived and increases in years lived, right? You're talking about the actual quality of life, and then I think you're also talking about the resilience of life, right? So the ability to respond to kind of that negative externality. But for what you guys have put in those chats, it's been deeply helpful, and I've really just enjoyed this conversation as a whole, and all of your ideas have been great.
Terrific. There is some controversy, I think, in the health context, not so much in this context, around quality adjusted life years. I just, I'm not an expert in it at all, but it does sometimes raise hackles around kind of what the sort of some kind of norm setting, I think, or something that then everything is measured against, or it's only measured in the deficit against the mean. I don't really understand all the methodological questions, but I know that it's not without its own detractors, and we probably have to sort through some of those issues as well.
I love the frame of listening first and pulling in the voices of communities. Much like the tournament, we are still a little ways away from a winner, but we have found a pool of possible winners that could all make sense as a possible metric depending on the situation. Thanks again for hosting, and thanks to each attendee and lending your brains to help us figure this out. Many thanks. Much love and talk soon.
Thank you, Napoleon. I will say, I think Cynthia mentioned Activist, which Napoleon's also a co-founder of, and I believe Partners in Equity that Wilson works with. He's a partner there. So Napoleon has his fingers in many pies, and it's been a terrific privilege and pleasure working with you, Napoleon. Yangbo, one of our regulars, and you did have. Actually, I just have to apologize, Young, because it wasn't quite a metric. It was a little bit more of an investment strategy. So maybe just explain what you were talking about.
Well, so it's actually quite tied in. It's a more granular way of quantifying, because at least was increasing wealth. That's what we picked. So more of a granular way of quantifying it, since what is relevant. And in fact, over a century ago, municipalities in the States used to do this all the time, but rather look at a plot of land, and then you can see how much wealth is it generating on a per acre basis. And there's actually a company based in Asheville, North Carolina called Urban 3. I put that link in the chat for our reference, who have been going around the country quantifying all of that. And what it's revealing is that what you generally find is that, well, contrary to what many people might believe, it is in fact the poorer and more marginalized neighborhoods that actually are more financially productive than the more affluent ones, if you measure on a value per acre basis. So what effectively is happening is that, and this is something we're seeing they've documented, is really an effective transfer of wealth over the last second half of the 20th century, especially from the poor existing neighborhoods within a city to the wealthier growing parts of the city further out. So that's generally what you're seeing. So again, do check out that link for some further diving. They also have a partner in North Carolina going national called Just Accounting for Health. And what they've been zeroing on lately is how what we're finding is, and it's not just North Carolina, it's happening in Chicago and many other places where people whose houses are generally in poor neighborhoods, generally have lower valuation, they tend to be assessed at higher rates for local taxes than those with higher value homes in more affluent neighborhoods. So you have that still persisting as well. So that was why I brought that indicator, that value per indicator up.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I've just had a chance to briefly scroll through the comments, which I can't really process in real time here, but we will look through closely. Is there anybody else who wants to suggest a metric or suggest a method to find a metric or an application? There was some talk about application in public equities. I know Rob Brown was on earlier, and others were talking about that. I noticed that. I have a general question, which Dorian, you might have some thoughts on, which is one of the ImpactAlpha theses that some people have, and I think this came up in the activist and the municipal bond market call as well, is that in some cases the historical discrimination and disadvantage can now be the source of the current alpha, just put it that way. If something is undervalued, then it has more room to grow up, or you could invest at a lower valuation and therefore get more appreciation. It comes up in a lot of context here, and I wonder how you think about how that figures into sort of the way you think about investing.
Yeah, so I think that there are deep opportunities in spaces that have been undercapitalized, depending on who has ownership, who is making those economic decisions, and who is able to make those investments, right? And I think it goes to back to that space about actually being able to thrive in place. You can use the example of, places like our anchor institutions, or specifically our HBCUs, deeply undercapitalized, but they hold a lot of value, right? So you can take a place, there's no HBC with a $1 billion endowment, right? Matter of fact, I think if you take the top 10, you barely get to $2 billion. Yet still that they're producing at least 17% of our college degrees, right? I think there's hidden alpha into those spaces, but it always depends on who is managing that investment, who it leads to deep ownership into, and where you can start to build in kind of those hidden corners of the market that have been undercapitalized for so long, which is also brings the point of why it's deeply important to have money managers of color into the space. I think people talk about, I don't like the term emerging managers because I don't think it necessarily values all of the experience people bring into the investment experience that people bring into the sector. But I do think that when you're talking about managers of color, which is part of how we think in and around Fund 1, it is that you need to increase the assets under management, and there's a deep opportunity because they're proximate to investment that others are not, where they understand communities in different ways. They understand what those investments can be. They have a deeper historical context, and oftentimes they value the assets in a very different way or evaluate the assets in very different ways. And so it depends on the side of who's having that conversation, because I think it can be had in a nefarious way, or it could be had in an extremely beneficial way.
Right. I see Caitlin Rosser. I think Caitlin, your just straight ahead wealth was the winner. I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but do you want to just say how you think about measuring and understanding that in Calvert's work?
Sure. Yeah, I was just about to jump off, but happy to come in for a little bit too. And I fully acknowledge that the submission was intentionally very blunt, and that wealth is. Yes. It's a blunt tool, and it doesn't recognize all of the different contexts. And what I really appreciate from this conversation is that it also doesn't recognize the inputs from actual people. Like actual people being affected. It's just what we are thinking is it's a very paternalistic metric. It's not necessarily coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the top down. But at least for the one of the key metrics we look at Calvert Impact. It's one of the key metrics that the new mission driven bank fund, which is a joint venture Calvert Impact's working on with Elizabeth Park Capital Management, to invest in minority deposit institutions and CDFIs. I mean, that is going to be our North Star, is increase in assets, increase in wealth. And I will note to the ownership metric, I mean, ownership is one way to measure wealth. So kind of talking a little bit about the methodology of how you might measure wealth. I mean, we're looking at assets, including real assets, including business property, including, the home value of homeowners' homes, including, then more liquid assets like bank accounts and that sort of thing. So I fully acknowledge that it is a very blunt tool, but the reality is that this data is not easily collectible either. And when you're working with traditional institutions, I mean, CDFIs are not traditional institutions, but CDFIs can't even reliably collect information on the assets of end clients on a reliable basis, let alone, some of the banks that we're working with. So I think that there's an element of kind of idealism, what would we ideally like to collect? But reality also sets in, and we need to think about the practicality. So what can we practically request of banks, or through a means like 60 decibels as well, because then that gets you some of the hard data, but then also the direct input from the stakeholders too. So that I really like, because it marries both of those two things that I think are really, really critical when you're trying to drive to outcomes. It's not just driving to the outcomes that you as the investor think are important, but that the end stakeholder really thinks are important too.
Thank you. Erika, Mike, any last thoughts, and then we'll let folks go?
No, this has just been a great discussion. Thanks so much for setting it up and inviting me to participate. I'm constantly learning, hearing, and I'm trying to build a better mousetrap myself. So I appreciate being part of it.
Thank you so much.
And likewise, I came in pretty dubious about the one metric to rule them all prospect, but I've probably moved a little bit in that direction over the course of the call. So thank you for helping me keep on learning.
Well, I also was dubious, but I became somewhat more convinced. I like the carbon analogy in the sense that it can work. You know, it can be both a forest strategy or a carbon capture strategy or a home electrification strategy, and there's a common metric against it. So I sort of started thinking, well, Napoleon's onto something, which he usually is. And so I think we can all think more about it. I also will say that, and no offense to you metrics wonks, my eyes often glaze over on this conversation on brand metrics as folks do, but I've come 180 degrees on that, and I now realize that we have to have some kind of sense of where we're going and knowing whether we're getting there. So I've come around on metrics in general, and I will say that as in terms of our audience, it turns out metrics and measurement and management more broadly is the top topic in surveys and whatever that we do. So I think it's because it is a practical and skill that folks need in this impact investing world. So I want to thank everybody for joining, for everybody for playing our game, for bearing with our kind of hopefully fun but maybe a little funky methodology of our own here, and we'll round it all up, round up some of your comments, and hopefully see you on our next call. With that, I thank everybody for joining, and have a great day.
Really appreciate it.
Thank
you, David. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye-bye.